All right. Well, again, I can't thank you all enough for coming. I think this is a really interesting topic because it's a question that I get all the time when it comes to sulfites. People get very confused about sulfites. They get very confused about what it means, what it's doing to them, why it's in their wine. So I just thought it would be a fun one to kind of clear up and talk a little bit about what all that means. That gets thrown around quite a bit when it comes to sulfites. So I'll go ahead and get us started right now. And it is literally probably one of the top questions that I would get when we had the shop open. You know, it's just like people were very confused about what sulfites are and where they come from and if it's what's giving them headaches. And there's a lot of interesting a lot of interesting misinformation out there, but we're going to clear all that up. So just to get on with it, what are sulfites? We're going to talk about it. So when we talk about sulfites, it is about knowing what's in your glass, but in specific, if you will, sulfites are essentially, very specifically, it is a group of compounds that are derived from the element sulfur, which is a naturally occurring element on the periodic table, atomic number 16, I believe. It is the 10th most common element on Earth. So it's a really common natural organic product element. And sulfites are really just derivatives of those. It's a group of compounds, and there's about 6 or 7 different variations that sulfites can kind of take, or things that are sulfites. So all of these things, the goal is really to understand that sulfites are natural. They are natural compounds. They are not chemically induced, but they are very commonly used as a preservative in a wide range of foods. Now, to go back really quickly, sulfur as an element, it's really interesting. It's actually kind of like this yellowish brick color. It's found in and around volcanic areas, most specifically. And what's really interesting about sulfur is that it actually burns with like a blue flame when it's burned. And when you burn it is when you create something called sulfur dioxide. So sulfur dioxide is actually the gas that is released when you burn the element of sulfur. So the sulfites that exist, that we use in wine, that are used in many different foods and do occur in very small amounts naturally within organic compounds. But it's really typical. Sulfites are really used a lot in dried fruits, for example, fresh fruit salads too, and the peeled potatoes, sausages, all kinds of food products. They're everywhere, and they're not harmful to people. They're not harmful to ingest because again, they are natural. But we're going to talk about what the properties of sulfites are that are why we use them as preservatives in food, because that is really essentially what we're doing, not just with food, but also with wine when they're introduced into wine as well. And finally, when we talk about adding sulfur to, or sulfites to wine, and also in food, there are 2 different kind of versions that it take. With wine, most often we're talking about sulfur dioxide, and we're also talking about that with food as well. But there are other elements like the salt versions as well that are used very, potassium metabisulfite. That's the other one that I was trying to think of that. But that's one that's kind of like a powdered form. And when you put that out there, if you kind of like spread that, it binds to water molecules and releases the sulfur dioxide gas. The sulfur dioxide gas is really kind of fun because it's been used for centuries, actually, back into ancient times, and still today, one of the most common ways to clean a wooden wine barrel is to burn a sulfur candle inside of the barrel. And that's because when you burn the sulfur candle, it releases sulfur dioxide, which, as we'll talk about, binds with the water molecules that are in the freshly washed barrel, and thus rendering it sort of stable and no longer removing bacteria and all those things. So it's one of the properties of the sulfites. So sulfur dioxide is what we're really going to focus on when we talk about wines, because that's what is most commonly used in conjunction with winemaking, and also the other processes of like vineyard management and all these things. So SO2, as I mentioned, sulfur dioxide, it's a gas that is formed when the sulfur reacts with oxygen. So when it burns, it's very common olden times, they used to talk about sulfuring and use the verb as a sulfuring kind of verb, which was a misnomer because you're not actually using the element sulfur, but rather the byproduct, which is the sulfur dioxide. And the powdered potassium metabisulfite, as I mentioned, this is what is very commonly dusted onto grapes either right after they're harvested or as they're coming into the winery, because it's easy to manage. As a powdered form, you know, you're not worried about kind of going everywhere. And when it reacts with the juices and the water that is naturally coming out of the grapes and sort of precipitating on the skins of the grapes, that is when it sort of releases that little SO2 gas just right in the micro area of where that chemical reaction is taking place, but it protects the grapes at that point. So it's a very, very common, very, very easy way to preserve those freshness, the freshness of the grapes as they're coming in from the vineyard. It's so important. We know as soon as you cut those grapes off the vine, they start to die. So the goal of good winemaking is you want to maintain as much freshness as possible. And a lot of that, as we talked a little bit about last week, has to do with limiting the amount of oxygen that can get to those grapes, which is where SO2 and sulfur dioxide comes in quite a bit. So it's good to know that SO2, sulfur dioxide, is water soluble. So it is technically, when you mixed with water, it turns into sulfuric acid. It's true. So we've actually got a lot of times sulfuric acid in the wine, but don't worry, we're all okay. The sulfuric acid is very, 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 very low amounts, and it requires a lot higher levels of both sulfur dioxide and hydrogen sulfuric acid to be able to cause any impact or maleffects on us. So we don't have to worry about that at all. But to kind of give you an understanding of what sulfuric acid is the element that was once sort of attributed to the cause of acid rain. So the idea was, this was back years and years ago, decades and decades ago, I should say. In England, there were these factories that were basically allowing the sulfur dioxide to be released into the atmosphere as they were sort of cleaning out their pipes, so to speak, which in theory shouldn't be a problem. But what it was doing was it was traveling up into the atmosphere and actually shifting over Scandinavia. And it was mixing in the clouds with the water in the clouds and coming down as sulfuric acid or acid rain. And in theory, this isn't proven, but this is really the expected or sort of the suspected cause, that the rain, as it came down as the sulfuric acid decimated some conifer forests in Scandinavia. Very, very sad, but very, very extreme also. It's not, that was basically, although that hasn't been officially denoted as the reason, it did lead to a huge cleanup in the British factories and factories throughout England to go ahead and remove and suppress the sulfur dioxide when they were sort of, and filter it out essentially when they were releasing any gases into the atmosphere. So it's good to know. But again, the large doses that we're talking about are so much larger than anything we would ever even remotely approach when we're talking about winemaking. So this is the big one. Sulfur dioxide does cause an allergic reaction to a very, very, very small amount of the population. Specifically, about maybe 1% of all human population is reactive in an allergic way to sulfur dioxide. The reality is that for the most part, these are people who already have symptoms of asthma. So if you're asthmatic, it has a lot to do with that gas, because if you're breathing SO2 or sulfur dioxide in larger amounts, it makes you cough. It's something that you breathe that in, and it gets you, it causes you to, you know, have respiratory issues. So therefore, people who already are kind of predisposed to respiratory issues may have reactions to sulfur dioxide. Even in the wine itself, even when it's soluble and when it's dissolved into the wine and into the liquid. So that is where the major reaction demographic is. And the truth is, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, it's not what actually most people think is causing headaches when they drink wine. There's a few reasons we're going to talk about why that is and what are the actual more likely reasons for people to be kind of getting their wine headaches, if you will, as they drink their wine. Very sadly too, because no one wants to have a headache when they're drinking, or after, or before, or ever. But you know, it's all good. So why do we even bother using SO2 in wine? It has really, really important properties, and the three main ones we're going to go over right now. The most important is that sulfur dioxide does operate as an antioxidant. That means that it actually eliminates oxygen molecules to prevent oxidation. And as I just mentioned earlier, and as we did talk about last week, oxygen is the enemy when it comes to winemaking. We want to remember that as soon as oxygen starts, it's so reactive, and as soon as it is exposed, as soon as any part of the grape or the must is exposed to oxygen, it immediately begins to deteriorate and begins to break apart the wine and or the must itself. This is the process of oxidation. This is the beginning of the process that eventually will turn wine into vinegar. So it's a constant battle with the winemaker to regulate how much oxygen is being introduced during the winemaking process in order to preserve freshness. The more oxygen you have, the less fresh your wine is. Now, that's part of the mystery and the magic of winemaking, is knowing that in small doses, it can add complexity, it can add character, it can add beautiful nuance and really unique expression to wines and to grapes that are being used for the wines, but it's about knowing how much. And the history of winemaking, of course, especially white winemaking in particular, because it's more prone to oxidation. We'll talk about that a little bit. The history of white winemaking, for example, ancient Italy, you know, it used to be like brown oxidized wines that had no fruit. Very, very typical. That was kind of what was done for the most part. But, and that was a result of just not knowing how to regulate, or even that oxygen was really the problem. So oxygen is the catalyst for breaking down wine. And so to be able to stop that by the use of sulfur dioxide is one of the main reasons that we do see that often used as the antioxidant agent within winemaking. And how does it do that? Well, I'm so glad you asked, because I'm going to tell you. So the way, chemically speaking, the molecules of sulfur dioxide actually combine with the oxygen molecules. And thus, in doing so, they render the oxygen molecules inoperable. So the oxygen no longer is able to bind with any of the other chemicals and start breaking them down, because the SO2 binds with it first. SO2 is very, very reactive as well, just like oxygen. So when they find each other, it will kind of take it out of action really quickly. Sometimes not really quickly, but the idea is that sulfur dioxide will bind with oxygen, and when it does that, the oxygen can no longer interact with the wine, the must, or any other element that is part of the winemaking process. Now, the tricky part is that it is kind of slow. The reaction can be slow. So sulfur dioxide and oxygen can coexist and symbiotically for a while before it starts to have an effect, or before it might start to bind with the oxygen molecules. So the scary part is that period before the SO2 actually has the opportunity to render the oxygen inert. And now this is where we get into the idea of natural winemaking, natural fermentations, natural yeasts, things like that. When we're talking about a more natural, oh, I'm so sorry, I have a question really quick from Jeff. Doesn't sulfur dioxide exists naturally in stomach as parts of digestion? You know, I'm not sure if it's part of digestion. It does exist within the human body naturally as well, but I can't speak to its application of the digestive process. I'm sorry, Jeff, but I can find out afterwards and maybe put it in the notes and get back to you on that. But if anyone else happens to know, by all means, please share. Or a byproduct of digestion. I don't know. That's a great question. I will be very excited to find the answer myself. But really going back to the idea of this immediate action and reaction of SO2 and oxygen. When we're talking about natural yeast and using natural fermentations, which is the non or low intervention process that is very obviously popular and also, you know, well championed right now. The truth is that sometimes those native yeast or those, you know, wild fermentations, sometimes they don't start as quickly as when you inoculate your wine. You know, when you're getting a cultured yeast, you kind of know it's going to go, you got your environment all set, and you put it in there, boom, fermentation starts right away. And then once fermentation starts, you don't have to worry about that oxygen because the carbon dioxide is being produced, right? So the carbon dioxide is protecting the wine during the fermentation process, and you don't necessarily need to worry about having any sort of sulfur to bind with the oxygen. But during this process of natural fermentations or wild fermentations, if there's a period of 3 or 4 days where the wine is just, or I'm sorry, I should say the must, is just sitting there, kind of waiting for fermentation to start, that's when as a winemaker it can get to be a little scary, because during that process, during that time period, oxygen can have a very, very detrimental effect while you're waiting for the fermentation to start. So this is a period where sometimes a little bit of sulfur dioxide might be added in order to prevent any kind of oxidation during that waiting period for natural yeasts. It's good to know that sulfur dioxide does not kill yeasts. They're very robust. They aren't affected by sulfur dioxide. So that by adding the sulfur dioxide in, you're not going to risk any sort of intervention with the fermentation process. So antioxidant is the first one, and antiseptic is the next one, which is always a fun way to say it, but it is antiseptic. Really what it means is antimicrobial. So it kills bacteria. It kills that in 2 ways, and it's and this is also very, very important for the stability of the wine, because a lot of times we tend to think about oxygen as being the only detrimental effect to wine, but in truth there are a lot of, you know, small microbes, little bacterium that exist, you know, that come in from the vineyard that may be in the winery as well. You know, Brettanomyces is technically, you know, a bacteria that can be affect the flavor and aromas of the wine. So what sulfur dioxide can do is it actually acts as an antimicrobial agent or an antiseptic by killing the bacteria, and also by rendering the oxygen that the bacteria needs to survive inert. So it kind of does it twofold, and it's really, really it's important for things like, specifically, Acetobacter is the #1 bacteria, and that is responsible for turning wine into vinegar, which needs the introduction of oxygen as well. But the presence of the Acetobacter, which is a very, very common bacteria, is what aids that process. So by having a sulfur in there to kind of not only poison the bacteria itself, but also take the oxygen out of the equation, you now have a more stable product that is no longer going to run the risk of any sort of bacterial infection or fault due to bacteria invasion. The other bacteria that is very common, of course, is our lactobacillus, the lactic acid bacteria that is used for malolactic fermentation. Again, this is a naturally occurring bacteria, very common. And as we talked about last week as well, malolactic fermentation happens in white wines, it happens in red wines, it happens to many, 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 many wines. And it oftentimes is an aid in creating stability for the wine and creating a flavor profile. But maybe you don't want your wine to go through malolactic fermentation, right? Maybe you do not want your Riesling to, you know, produce any diacetyl that smells like butter and tastes like popcorn, you know? So in which case, how do you stop the malolactic fermentation from happening? There's twofold what you do. You use generally sulfur dioxide in order to kill the bacteria, and then you find and filter out whatever remaining bacteria there is. HS2 is a byproduct, not SO2. Stomach acid is hydrochloric, not sulfuric. Oh my goodness, this is a great biology class we're getting right now. H2S, being hydrochloric acid, I'm assuming, Alessa, is a byproduct, not SO2. Okay, so I see what you're saying is that in Jeff's question, he was asking if sulfur dioxide was a byproduct of digestion, but potentially what we're thinking of is more hydrochloric acid, the H2S, as opposed to, oh dear, there's another 3-letter word that I don't know. HC1?
HCl is hydrochloric acid. H2S is some kind of sulfuric something or other, hydrogen sulfide.
Okay. And so the hydrogen sulfide is the byproduct of digestion?
Yeah.
Excellent.
According to my very, very quick Google search.
No, I appreciate it. I think it's fascinating. And Jeff just made a pun. He says, thank you, Alessa. While your answer is a bit hard to stomach, I'll take it. Look at us, you guys. So clever. How I love you all. But no, seriously, Alessa, thank you for that, because there's no way I was going to be able to look that up right now or even probably understand it when I did. So I think what we're determining, but obviously you can always do more research, but I think we're determining that sulfur dioxide is not a byproduct of digestion. We'll say that for now, if we to be proven false later. But it is, sulfur dioxide is the cause of stopping malolactic fermentation if and when you would like to do that. Oh, good. I like it. I like your wife already, Jeff. She sounds great. Okay. And then the third most important thing, and this is kind of in relation to the other two as well, that sulfuric acid acts as an antioxidasic. So what does that mean? And I know I sound like I know a lot about science, but really it's just very specifically associated with wine. But basically, oxidases are enzymes, and enzymes are essential for all chemical reactions that exist in life. They basically are catalysts. So an oxidase is a catalyst, that an enzyme that promotes oxidation. So it's thinking about it like this. When you have an apple sitting out on and it's not cut and it's covered and the skin is covering it, basically it's being protected from the oxygen. But when you cut it and it starts to brown, it doesn't just brown just because of the oxygen. It browns because there are enzymes that exist on the surface area of the apple that help to promote the oxidation. It's good to know that enzymes and these these catalysts, they are essential for enabling a chemical reaction to take place, but they're not actually part of the reaction itself. They're sort of just like they're like an on switch. So they are there to go ahead and say, okay, you can start, you can go. So once again, oxidases will rapidly promote oxidation of something, of wine, of fruit, of anything, of any kind of interaction with that. And so that's what happens when you see that apple that starts to brown, or that piece of fruit that starts to brown and discolor on the table. So the sulfur dioxide similarly does the same thing like it does with the bacterium, where it will poison these enzymes and prevent them from being able to act as catalysts, thus reducing the oxidation process even further. So that means that it's killing the enzymes, and then also adding that kind of as a bonus to its abilities to prevent the oxidation. Nancy is asking a great question right now. Lemon juice does the same thing. What's the relationship? That is a great question, Nancy. Another one that I don't know the answer to, but I did have that thought. I think I was looking into it. Is it acid? Scott says it's acid. So the acid also kills off the enzymes potentially. Okay, cool. So I'm not sure. I guess when we think about it, when we think about sort of like the sulfur dioxide mixing with whatever the water is that's in the surface of the cut fruit, right? That turns it into, right, sulfuric acid, which would then have sort of that enzyme killing effect, the same as lemon juice would. So that kind of makes sense to me. I'm riffing on that right now for sure, but if acid is sort of the main reason for that, then that makes sense. Yeah. You know, that's my guess. That's my slightly educated guess, but we'll see how it goes. And then finally, the thing about that is that what we're really talking about now is preservation. So this antioxidasic, the removal of oxygen molecules, the rendering them ineffective. Essentially, we're talking about preserving things. We're talking about extending the life of something. And this is what sulfur dioxide and sulfites are used for in all ranges of foods. It's about preserving freshness, right? So obviously, when we talk about that with our wine, you need to be able to have that kind of opportunity to know that sulfur dioxide is there to assist you in preserving freshness, but it is not the answer to all things. Scott is saying to everyone as well, limes are used on margarita rims to kill the bacteria on the glasses from bad water. Well, look at that. I thought it was just a tasty treat. Lemons change pH enough to kill many bacteria to slow the process, i.e. guac. Yes, I mean, it makes perfect sense. So there we are. That's the acid. That's the acid answer. I like it. I like this. I like that everyone else is coming up with the answers, so I don't have to. Thank you. Oh, good, Cheryl. I'm glad. Fun class. It is fun. So this is what I think this is super interesting too, because when it comes to wine in particular, and I'm sure with all these other things as well, what we're talking about with sulfur is not just it is not just the sulfur dioxide itself and the oxygen molecules, but there's something called, when wine, we talk about total SO2. And the total SO2 is actually a combination of what we call free SO2 and bound SO2, right? So what does that mean? And it sounds self-explanatory, but I'm going to go over it anyway. Sulfur dioxide, as we mentioned, is pretty reactive as well. It's pretty reactive just like oxygen, but it doesn't just react with oxygen. It reacts with these other elements as well, like sugar is a very, very common one. Aldehydes and ketones, which are other byproducts that may be contained in the wine as well. In particular, when you get into wines that are either already slightly oxidized or kind of poorly managed or poorly made, you're going to find a lot more of these other elements. And that is what can happen when, if it combines with these other elements, it binds the SO2, and therefore that SO2 is no longer able to take that oxygen molecule out of the picture, which means that it's basically useless, right? So if you have a lot of these other elements in there, then what you're going to end up with is a lot of bound sulfur dioxide and not a whole lot of free sulfur dioxide. And when you want to have, you want your wine to have the free sulfur dioxide as you go through the process, and also at the time of bottling, because that's what's going to kind of help elongate and help elongate the shelf life, and also kind of help prevent spoilage and the reaction of oxygen or other bacterium with that particular bottle of wine. So that's why it's important to remember that while SO2 does act as a preservative and does it very effectively, oh, good, Nancy, I just answered your question. I'm glad. It does. So while SO2 is very effective as a preservative and with all these other qualities, it cannot take the place of poorly made wine. It is not an answer to being able to fix wine that has had too much oxygen introduced during the winemaking process, right? You still need, as a winemaker, to be very, very strict on how you're allowing that oxygen interaction during fermentation, after fermentation, before fermentation, all of those things. So SO2 does not fix the problem of bad wine. So now the question is, sulfites, do they cause the headaches? And as we mentioned earlier, the truth is really no. Sulfites are not generally the answer to why people may get headaches. Suzanne Green is asking, how do the other elements get into the wine? Some of them are just naturally occurring. Like, for example, sugar. Sugar already exists in the must, right? But sweet wines, and we'll talk about this, some wines have more residual sugar than others. And those sugar molecules can actually bind with the SO2 very readily, which means that, generally speaking, sweeter wines will have higher levels of SO2 in them, or sulfur dioxide, because they need that in order to provide more free SO2 to preserve the wine, right? So the higher the sugar content of the wine, the more SO2 is likely in the wine or is needed in the wine to preserve that freshness. Now, the aldehydes and the ketones that we're talking about, again, these are naturally occurring byproducts sometimes that happen during fermentation in various amounts. A ketone, one of the ketones that you're gonna know with also are the diacetyl that we were talking about last week. That buttery, the one that creates that buttery flavor, is actually a ketone. So that is, again, kind of a byproduct of the natural evolution of wine. As Nancy just mentioned, and riper wines, thus the higher pH, that's right. So the more acidic the wine, again, the better it is preserved. But interestingly enough too, the lower the pH, the more the sulfur dioxide can actually get dissolved into the wine as well. So there's kind of a balance again with that, where you have high acid wines, but then more of that sulfur dioxide is going to kind of dissolve into the wines as well. But higher pH wines, thus kind of riper wines, sweeter wines, wines that are just lower in overall acidity, will tend to have more of those reactive elements in them as well. So Suzanne, I hope that answered your question as well. But when it comes to the headaches, the sulfites aren't generally the cause. The people, again, it's basically 1% of the population, and maybe 3 to 4% of people who are asthmatic, right, have this reaction to sulfur dioxide. In reality, what tends to happen is very commonly just dehydration, good old dehydration, and then other histamines, just other elements that people can be allergens that will exist in the wine, but that are not actually sulfites. But dehydration is a big cause. A lot of times people just don't drink a lot of water while they're drinking wine, right? We've all been there. And it is that wonderful kind of idea of, you know, drink a glass of wine before every glass of, or just drink a glass of water before every glass of wine. Thank you, Trent. I see you doing that right now. I appreciate that. He's leading by example. But it's also important to note that we do have a whole lot of, yes, and Nancy's just asking, what about that flush sensation, not headache, but heat? Again, they say that's more caused by histamine. So it's more of these kind of like a reaction to alcohol, actually, again, that will cause sort of causing you to be awake at night and to have that flushed warming feeling. The sulfites just aren't necessarily, because they're not really an allergen, but there are other allergens that people do have, that people have, that they have in wine naturally. And every person is different. It's really important to remember that. But a lot of times we talk about, and some wine has crazy high alcohol levels, yes. And sometimes it's the sugar in the wines. Like some people are more sensitive to sugar than others. And a lot of times we have to remember, especially when we're talking about New World wines, we're talking about California wines, there are lots of other additives that are not sulfites that go into the wine sometimes. And these are very, very reactive for some people, and you just don't know what they are because there's no label for them. The only thing, part of the reason why people do blame sulfites so much of the time is because it's one of the only things that's on a wine label. It says contains sulfites, but it only has to contain 10 parts per million to require that label, which is basically all wine, because it's very uncommon to find any wine with just naturally occurring levels of sulfur dioxide that are less than 10 parts per million. When we talk about the, and some people might be allergic to yeast, exactly, Nancy, that's another one too. Yeast and sugar, two elements that are always in wine and that some people are very, very reactive to. A lot of people are reactive to yeast without realizing it. It can cause a lot of inflammation for people. And again, it's that inflammation, the histamines, and that causes more of that flushingness, more of that, that kind of reaction, and sometimes the headaches as well than the others. And then we have, and the alcohol that dehydrates us. Yes, sorry. Thank you guys, you're answering each other's questions. You're so good today, I appreciate it. And yes, of course, alcohol is a diuretic, right? It helps us, it actually, part of how it dehydrates us is that it makes us pee more. It's a diuretic, so it's a rather effective one too, if anyone has noticed. So that's why, because you lose more water when you drink alcohol, you need to regenerate your water more for that. But when we talk about wines, how much sulfites are, how much, what is the actual amount of sulfites that are in the wines? So the tannins, and people also blame tannins a lot too, because they oftentimes get headaches after drinking red wine. And then they'll say, oh, it's the tannins or the sulfites. So a couple things to remember, actually, your red wines tend to have less sulfites than white wines and sweet wines, partially because the tannins themselves are antioxidants, right? They are also help to prevent the oxidation, and because these exist naturally in the grape skins, you don't find them in the white wine, so white wines don't have the added protection of the antioxidant qualities of the tannins themselves. These are also found like in the stems and the seeds, all of that stuff. But the point is, red wines have tannins, and that helps to protect them more and helps to, again, stabilize them and sort of give them a longer shelf life because of that. But it's important to know, like, people blame tannins and sulfites, but these are not items that are exclusive to wine, right? You've got, as we talked about, sulfites in dried fruit can be like up to 1,000 to 3,000 parts per million. In the United States, a wine, the maximum amount of sulfites you can have in a regular wine is 350 parts per million. But that is way, way high. Most wines don't even have that much. A lot of typically wines will have closer to like, you know, much, much lower than 350. And sometimes, I mean, they'll go all the way up there depending on how much is added. But it's important to know, like, tea has tannins, right? Green tea has tannins, black tea has tannins, chocolate has tannins. So if you think that you might be reactive to tannins or sulfites, are you reactive when you have things like dried mango, dried fruit, chocolate, tea? If you're not, then likely those aren't the causes for your reactions when you're drinking wine. And again, as I mentioned, everybody reacts differently. So it's up to you to really be able to monitor your own experience objectively and kind of take notes of that before you just totally blame that. Ooh, there's a good one here. Someone is giving me, here we are. Scott, yes, alcohol dehydrates. Another secret of alcoholics, as you drink, you dehydrate and colored particles stick to your blood and you have a hard time getting it to break free so water can rebind. Most hardcore alcoholics drink gin or vodka, not Morgan and Coke for that reason. Red wines have colored particles that bind to your blood. Whites are normally slightly higher in sugar, which is why your liver heats up, burning that sugar 4 to 6 hours later so you wake up hot. Enough red can do this too. Deborah is saying, any truth to females often becoming less tolerant of wine as they age due to changing hormones? You know, I think you can blame hormones on anything. I feel like the answer to that is like, sure. But I would not have the medical wherewithal to be able to speak to that specifically. But I would assume, just like as you're aging, as everything, your body changes. I mean, you can have no allergies when you're 5 and then suddenly become allergic to shrimp when you're like 30, right? Bodies are crazy the way that happens. And I'm sorry for anyone that happens to with wine. I really hope, I hope that doesn't happen to a lot of people. IV centers, yeah, the IV centers for rehydration, sure, absolutely. Nick, that happened to you with shellfish. I'm very sorry to hear that. I truly am. I feel like there are some things that, you know, you wake up one day and wow, I would be really sad if suddenly like I couldn't have bread. I mean, I would be bummed, let me tell you. So the question, of course, going into how much SO2 is actually in your wine, this is going back to this idea of what are we talking about when we're talking about sulfites? And every country has its own regulations for what is required. And most of it, again, is not put on the label. So there's really no way for you to know. But generally speaking, if it has that label on it that says contains sulfites, it's only if there's more than 10 parts per million, which, as I mentioned, is pretty much every wine. When we're talking about organic grapes, so again, in the United States, the maximum allowable is 350s. Typical dry red wine will have much, much less than that. Like I said, 50 to 100 maybe. Now, when we get into, but really that's a broad range. To say anywhere between 0 and 350 is a very, very wide range. So that's where we get into these sort of advanced labelings of certifications for organic, for biodynamic, things like that. This will get tricky, of course, because as we talked about last month, organic and biodynamic means different things, whether you're in the EU or in the United States. If you're coming from the EU, if it's an organic wine, you're only allowed you are allowed up to 100 parts per million of sulfites, and that can include added or organic sulfites. In the US, the organic regulation says you can't add any sulfites, but as we talked about, there are going to be naturally occurring sulfites that are there, whether or not you're adding them. So therefore, there will still be some level of sulfites in the wine. And it is very, very challenging. And it's important to know this. It's very, very challenging to be able to make wine that can travel without adding just a little bit of sulfites to the wine. A lot of times people think that they add the sulfites at the time of bottling to prevent re-fermentation, but really what they're doing is to try and prevent any kind of microbial. It's more of a microbial thing at that point than we're worried about re-fermentation in the bottle, like existing yeasts, because yeasts, again, are responsible for fermentation, and yeasts do not get killed by sulfur dioxide. So it's really more about the stability of the wine in the sense of trying to prevent any kind of microbial intervention with the wine. And again, it's important to note as well, it varies. Even within like the EU and the United States, generally speaking, red wine, dry red wine has the lowest allowable amount of sulfites. As you go up, and then white wine is allowed a little bit more, right? The sweet wines are allowed more, and then, you know, and sparkling wines as well. So there's different levels of allowable sulfites, total sulfites in each of these wines based on categories, based on where you're from, based on where you're bottling. It's fascinating when you start to look into it, because as a winemaker, you have to think about that. If you're trying to export your wine to another country, you have a lot of different regulations that you need to make sure you're compliant with. You need to be very aware of what all of these different countries are. Australia has a wonderful website for winemakers where they kind of go like step by step. Here's what you need for this. This is what is, you know, required in Australia. But if you're trying to export to here, this is what you need to regulate. If you're trying to export to here, these are your levels. And we talked about the natural wine a little bit with Brian too last month when he was here. And we have to remember too, natural wine doesn't have any kind of legal definition, right? There is no authoritative regulatory body for natural wines at this time. Generally speaking, though, what we refer to and what we tend to assume about natural wines is that there is little to no sulfur dioxide being used, and that the process is all natural, right? This is partially why, you know, sometimes natural wines don't taste good because they don't have the, because maybe they're not being made with enough very, very specific care during the process to prevent that kind of the oxidation or the microbial stability that the little bit of SO2 that could be added to it might be able to stabilize that wine, or might be able to keep that freshness a little bit better, might be able to allow that wine to be open for an extra day or so. So it is a challenge with that, but it is important to note that, again, natural wines, while they don't have any regulated sulfite level, we again generally refer to them as having low or no added sulfite. So it's really about that's that. And speaking of that's that. So that is this. I mean, there were some really, really great questions today, and I know it's a heady topic, and I really wasn't expecting the digestion stuff, but that is fascinating too. So I think, as we can see, there's just there's a wide range of applications for sulfur dioxide. I guess the takeaway that I would want to encourage people to take away from this is just knowing that sulfur dioxide and sulfites are not the enemy. They have really, really important winemaking properties. They have really, really important, thank you, Ricardo. I'm so glad. I'm glad you loved it. Wonderful. But sulfites are a useful tool. They're a very, very useful tool in the winemaking process when used judiciously in order to help create and assist wine to naturally be a delicious and wonderful and beautiful expression of what you're trying to make as a winemaker. So it doesn't have to be the enemy of the world, and it certainly isn't the worst additive that you can find in your wine. Next week, I am, since we're talking a little bit more, yes, Kimberly, thank you, you're welcome. But next week, as we go into, I'm doing this like into the bottle thing, and what I'm going to talk about a little bit more is some of the other additives that we might not know go into our wines, and also kind of that process of like once the wine is done, getting it into that bottle, and why it's so important, kind of like the process into the bottle, closing the bottle, and getting it onto the shelf, because there's more that you kind of then you realize is going on during that. So it's really, really fun for that as well. And that's it. Yes, cheers. Well, thank you all. I didn't even get to ask what everyone was drinking today. I'm so sorry. Pellegrino, excellent. I appreciate you all again very much for being here. I know I say that a lot, but I really, really mean it. So thank you. And that's that. You are welcome, everybody. Thank you.